Hello guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and before we begin today's lecture, I'd just like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we last discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we conducted our analysis of the 1920s, and we discussed how the new technological breakthroughs were being driven by electricity. The 1920s saw the first electric washing machines. The radio became probably the most prominent item to be purchased. Automobiles maintained their status as luxury symbols. They were luxury automobiles, but due to the increasing competition, automobile manufacturers were forced to make scaled models to where they had models in which the average worker could afford, average models for the average middle class family, and of course models for the wealthy elites of the republic. We also saw the first home vacuums, and we really begin to see the dishwashers come into play as well. And slowly but surely, housework became mechanized. Tasks that normally took a week to do became something that can be done in a single afternoon. You can simultaneously clean all the floors and simultaneously wash all of the household laundry in a single day, in a single afternoon. We also saw refrigeration units. Home refrigerators came onto the market and have been an immediate hit ever since. And we also looked at the Ford-Meade-Macomber tariff. We'll come back to the Ford-Meade-Macomber tariff in our next two lecture topics. The Ford-Meade-Macomber tariff, of course, had it was well-meaning, but it was to have a sort of disastrous effect on global economics, though its stated intention was to shore up American domestic economic interest. And lastly, we looked at the transformation of the United States. The Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, Prohibition, bootlegging, motion pictures, sports, spectator sports, baseball recovered remarkably well from the Black Sox scandal that ended the 19-teens, and went on to become America's favorite pastime, and went on to become the national sport of the United States. And that was primarily due to the rise of the radio, because as we discussed in the lecture, baseball is a incredibly monotonous game when you have to sit there and watch it, but over the radio it takes on a life of its own. Every call, every play is amplified. Baseball is a game, it is said, that was made for radio, and it exploded in the 1920s, 1930s. And lastly, I just want to say that the 20s really laid the foundation for I want to reiterate, I should say, that the 20s laid the foundation for the modern United States in terms of our social outlook, social attitudes, expectation of new gadgets or gizmos that would make life infinitely easier. And with that being said, let's dive right into our topic for today. And for our topic today, we're going to look at the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. And to begin with, I'd like to say that minimal government regulation and unsound financial practices created unreal expectations among speculators in the 1920s. The collapse of Wall Street share prices in 1929 was dramatic. It really ruined the savings of thousands of Americans, and it ruined the lives of thousands of Americans who had been deceived by false hopes. One of the factors of the Wall Street crash was misdistribution or maldistribution of wealth among the population, the citizenry of the Republic in the early 20th century. The years between 1929 and 1933 witnessed a horrific downward spiral of economic shrinkage, bankruptcies, factory shutdowns, unemployment rates that continually skyrocketed. The unemployment rate just continually worsened across the board, across states and populations in the Republic. And to top it all, to add insult to injury, the Dust Bowl, which was a very severe drought that affected the Great Plains, added to the national woes. And President Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1928, and before then was acclaimed as a great national hero for his role as Secretary of Commerce throughout the 1920s, and before then for his dazzling effort, well, really his dazzling success at ending the famine and ending hunger in Europe after World War I. Hoover, he became the great scapegoat for these disasters, and Hoover's own economic and political apprenticeship, along with the string of professional successes that he had before, had not provided him with the outward or immediate tools necessary to identify or readily implement the fixes needed to combat the national calamities he encountered shortly after taking office. Now, to begin with, I'd just like to go back and sort of look at the situation in the 1920s. I know we discussed the 1920s and we did our recap of the 1920s, our analysis, but to really understand the Wall Street crash and the beginnings of the Depression, we have to look at business practices in the 1920s. And the first major one was the Florida land bubble. Now, during this time, there were a number of speculative bubbles that burst that could have been seen as forerunners or warning signs to the collapse that came. And the major forerunner occurred in Florida. The Florida land bubble was perhaps the biggest of them all. Florida has a very warm climate throughout the year, and it gained the reputation of a wonderful winter retreat destination and retirement location, even back in the early 1920s. It's one of those things that it just been one of the great draws for Florida throughout the past century. They were aided. Those who were seeking to go down to move to Florida, either relocating after retirement or simply seeking a winter retreat, they were aided by the completion of the National Railroad Network, and Florida experienced rapid growth in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Men like George Merrick, who had been a minister, became central figures in the land rush that saw developers flock to Florida and create lush advertisements to attract settlers to new communities. Merrick himself created Coral Gables, major area in Florida. The University of Miami's in Coral Gables. It was a nice area. And he created Coral Gables as an homage to Venice, Italy. The area had once been a swamp, but Merrick used the drainage canals and actually imported. He used a drainage canal to drain the area, and he actually imported Venetian gondoliers to ply their trade on the canals in Coral Gables. Now, one of the factors that made the settlement of southern Florida possible was the positive identification of mosquitoes as the vectors of malaria. With the development of mosquito suppression policies, malaria became less of a concern. Incidentally, mosquito suppression also allowed for the intervention in Haiti and the construction of the Panama Canal. Malaria was deadly, and it really ran through populations that weren't local to the area. That was one of the reasons why subsequent invasions of Haiti failed after the initial success of the early revolution, and really why Haiti was sort of left adrift for the 100 years after the ending of the Napoleonic Wars. And now with such policies in place, settlements grew rapidly. And just to look at Miami, probably the most well-known and definitely the most populous city in Florida now, Miami had a population of roughly 30,000 people in 1920. And 5 years later, in 1925, the population has soared to over 75,000. Now, at first, people were very careful regarding the type of land they acquired, opting for seafront property, and later for property where towns were being developed. As the boom continued, the tales of the greatness and opportunities in Florida spread, and speculators started buying land unseen, and unscrupulous business practices developed, with fraudulent ads for coastal lands being sent to unsuspecting buyers. Now, many of these fraudulent advertisements were for land that was far inland, often swampy, in areas that had either no plan for development, no drainage plans, and in many cases, the lands that were being sold had a combination of both of those things. They weren't being developed and they had no drainage plans. But as long as the market value kept rising, speculators could acquire this land, hold on to it for some time, and then sell it to an unsuspecting buyer, making a tidy profit in the process. Well, this entire process came to a jarring halt in 1926 when two hurricanes in quick succession swept through the Miami area. The two hurricanes combined cost over 400 deaths and left 50,000 people homeless. It was a great national catastrophe in the early 20th century. It was a death blow to the image of Florida as an idyllic tropical paradise. Property prices collapsed, with many local resorts and communities left in complete ruins. Also in the 1920s, the stock market prices also began to exceed real market values, encouraged by the legal financial practices which encouraged reckless spending, namely the advent of investment trust and buying on margin. They entailed allowing a speculator to buy shares with only a tenth of the value of the stock. The broker would keep the shares and sell them if the buyer was unable to meet the demands asked of him. Now, if a buyer had gone into speculation without the intention of holding on to the shares, without the intention of holding on to the stock and receiving yearly dividends from the company, but rather to sell the stock at a later date after the price rose, recollecting his initial investment along with a nice little profit, marginal buying worked fine. The speculator would have to recover the initial investment, pay off the debt that accrued to make the purchase, and walked away with a little profit. The margin trading, however, needed the market to go up to be profitable. Dividend rates paid by corporations, even the titans of industries of the day, were rarely more than 1 to 2% of the corporation's profits for the year. So speculators had to borrow money or buy on margin at 7 to 9% interest rate. And they were really not in a position to hold on to the stocks to see dividend returns on their investments. Now, the Federal Reserve, which was created back in 1914 by the Wilson administration to encourage the expansion of credit lending, they could have restrained the speculation practices. But the swelling of the stock market boom, along with the ascent of really well-known national financial figures, it sort of held their hand back, and this outlook really attracted members of all social classes who thought that they were being left behind by their contemporaries by not making the most of their money, by not applying their money to its full potential in their eyes. They sought to make relatively quick profits of 50%. Rather than the long-term small profits associated with stock dividends. Now, the stock market crash of 1929 ended that illusion for many people, along with causing, just great hardship. Now, there have been stock market crashes before, and there have been other crashes, economic crashes and economic panics. Early on in the lecture series, we looked at the economic panic of 1819, which sort of gave Andrew Jackson this major thrust and lent credibility to his stance against the Second National Bank. We also looked at the Panic of 1837, which dogged the Van Buren presidency, and which was largely caused by Andrew Jackson's destructive war on the Second U.S. National Bank. And of course, the Panic of 1873, which led to the cry of free silver that persisted throughout the remainder of the 19th century. And even earlier in the 20th century, there was a very noticeable crash in 1907. Now, the 1907 crash is notable for the leading business magnates of the day, like J.P. Morgan, gathering together to support the market and stem the tide of the economic fallout. This was remarkable this was a remarkable moment of the magnates coming together to do what was right for the republic. Sadly, a generation later, their sons would not be able to live up to the standard of their fathers. Now, in each case of those market crashes, the federal government's policy was to do nothing and to let the market and business leaders correct the situation themselves. It was looked at as a form of economic Darwinism, and the theory employed was that the strongest and the fittest companies would survive the economic fallout, while the weaker, unfit companies would fail, and economic reality, economic normalcy would return to business. The creation of the Federal Reserve was hoped by many observers and supporters has had the way to do away with the intrinsic fatality of the market. They hoped that the Federal Reserve would play a role much like the national banks had played in regulating the economy and offering support to the business community. Now, experts by then were very familiar with the boom and bust cycle of capitalism, and they were aware that that as the market grew, so too did the fallout during an economic bust. Nevertheless, they were confident that they had a major safety net with the Federal Reserve, and they also had other minor, sort of smaller safety mechanisms in place to prevent another economic crash from ever recurring. Well, in late 1929, economic growth halted, and it halted in a series of very sharp instances in the United States. And shortly afterwards, the stock market price just fell precipitously. And it all began on Thursday, October 4th, 1929, a day remembered as Black Thursday, because a total of 11 prominent financiers at the time committed suicide because they had been ruined, and was followed the next Tuesday, Tuesday the 9th of October 1929, when 12 million shares were traded back, were traded in a single day. And this was back when less than 1 million shares were traded in a single day. The 12 million shares being traded was just simply unprecedented in United States financial or economic history. The common image was that every American was investing in the stock market during the 1920s, and this is misleading. Less than 1% of the entire population was investing in the stock market, but this 1% was the most socially influential and wealthy in the republic. That's what sort of adds to the luster of the stock market crash. And their losses had disastrous consequences for the entire republic and the entire economy. From the stock market falling, the entire economy spiraled into a depression that persisted until World War II. Now, the cause of the Great Depression continues to be a great mystery for historians, economics, and other interested parties. There are not a lot of answers to why the Depression happened, and what is the relationship between the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. None of which completely, but there have been theories, a lot of prominent theories, but none of them completely satisfy answers. One of the theories, one of the answers to why everything went bad was overproduction. Overproduction, have we've already seen, overproduction by the farmers led to economic woes back in the 19th century. The farmers on the Great Plains, the Grange movement and so forth, the populist movement, they were all sort of in response to farmer woes, farmers' plights. And even persisting into the 1920s, the farmers were still in a very precarious situation because the agricultural industry had rebounded during World War I in the years immediately following World War I, but as European powers that their domestic agricultural industries regained health, it caused a sharp decline in in demand for American agricultural goods, and the farmers who had become accustomed to overproducing once again found themselves confronted with sharply falling crop prices. Had the market became really just oversaturated. Now, and overproduction for farmers had been a chronic problem, but it was not a common problem associated with the industrial community. Up until then, the only chronic problem associated with the industrial community was the misdistribution or maldistribution of income. The United States, when compared to other industrial nations, appeared to have a great and even distribution of wealth, but in reality, there was a grossly wealthy minority in the Republic. Successful consumer economies need income to be spread more widely, more evenly, so that far more people can purchase the consumer goods created. In the 1920s, roughly 5% of the population received 33% of all personal income. Henry Ford had the insight to pay his workers $5 a day, which transformed them into consumers of the products which they made. He did that back in the preceding decade, but he had not kept up with increasing his workers' wages to meet the current social atmosphere. Other industrialists were in the same boat. They had kept wages low, which did not meet the new levels of productivity of American industries, which kept workers from enjoying the goods which they themselves were producing. Now this is an economic quagmire. The industrialists had all the incentive to keep wages low, to maximize their profits, to satisfy their stock shareholders. Now this kind of policy also had the effect of denying spending power to the consumers, and the consumers were their employees. In a consumption economy, the producers have got to be the consumers as well. The leading magnates were not sufficiently mindful of this macro insight and distributed their income far too narrowly. Now, the problem was exacerbated by federal tariff policy. The tariff policy made things infinitely worse. Business, as we have discussed, was never laissez-faire. The government from the Washington administration had always sought to support domestic businesses and their interests at home and abroad. They successfully lobbied for protective tariffs to make the cost of foreign goods produced artificially higher, and their domestically produced goods produce goods sufficiently or intrinsically more attractive because they will be offered at a lower price than a foreign good. The agricultural industry, dating all the way back once again to the Washington administration, had never supported tariffs. They had never supported tariffs because it made it more difficult for them to export their goods abroad. In the 1920s, the United States was the dominant industrial power. Germany, France, United Kingdom, they were all reeling. They were all in a haze that continued from the effects of World War I. The industrialists did not need a protective tariffs, but still they lobbied for one, and the federal government granted them one. In the short term, it was a good and strategic move. Domestically produced goods spread globally very rapidly. Things like things that became staples, like breakfast cereals, began appearing in European markets, along with clothing and other quite iconic American consumer goods. This policy was short-sighted, however, and it backfired on the United States as the Europeans quickly ran out of money. They had no money to pay for these new goods, and they could not raise money by trading with the United States because of the high tariffs. These high tariffs effectively barred them from the United States, barred Europeans from sending European goods into the United States, and Congress again raised tariffs the tariffs for the United States in 1930. And this was done again in a misguided hope to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. Now, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles created an atmosphere of international fiscal instability. The high war reparations placed on Germany had the deliberate effect of stifling the German economy's France and the United Kingdom had wanted a weak Germany. and it made sense for them in terms of regional and global economics. It would have been much more preferable for France and United Kingdom to have Germany recover slower. But in terms of truly healthy global economy, it would have been much more preferable to have Germany recover faster and become a healthy global competitor. The slowness of economic recovery and the general unjustness of the reparations undermined the Weimar Republic's legitimacy, and the German people never had faith in the Weimar Republic's ability to lead the nation. And when Adolf Hitler appeared on the scene, they were more willing to support him. Hitler would go on to repudiate the Treaty of Versailles and the reparation payment that were forced on the German Republic. Now, these global factors had the effect of creating mass underemployment and unemployment in the United States. It really backfired really badly on the United States, and as far as domestic relations are concerned. People were working less hours, and most people didn't have jobs to go to work at all. Those who had been thrown out of work because the factory had closed, they were not blameworthy at all. They did not. They didn't really understand what was happening, and they began to internalize the blame and began to feel as though through some personal fault of their own, they fell so low. They began to feel that their current unfortunate situation was entirely something of their own doing. The Great Depression was characterized by workers fleeing their current locations and traveling the country looking for work. The migrant communities and really the term hobo comes into American lexicon. These hobos who rode the trains, often illegally, crisscrossed the Republic looking for work. The Depression itself became self-depreciating, had wage cuts and workers' layoffs led to a decreased national consumer spending power, which led to decreased consumer demands, which in turn led to decreased industrial output, which would turn to wage cuts and layoffs to sort of balance things out. So it became the very self-depreciating, self-destructive cycle. And as this was all happening to the industrial sector of the economy, drought conditions in the Great Plains hit the agricultural sector, and it hit it with a vengeance. The Great Dust Bowl, intensified all of these other national miseries. As we have seen, shortly after the Civil War, the Great Plains, the interior, what one referred to as the Great American Desert, was settled, and it was settled fairly rapidly. At first, the settlers enjoyed some boom years, but in the 1880s, rainfall decreased and many farms failed. The great golden age of the plains farmers was the 1910s. Had wartime demands for food skyrocketed, and farmers outshined themselves. They really produced more. They put more and more of their land under heavy cultivation in an effort to maximize their profits, and also to meet the wartime demand for grain and other agricultural goods in Europe. In the 1920s, however, as Europe began to recover and their agricultural sector began to recover, the prices of American grain and American agricultural goods fell, and they fell rapidly, and they continued to fall well into the 1930s. A catastrophic drought hit right as the industrial sector was tanking. A catastrophic drought hit the plains, and really the plains from the Dakotas on down are known for being a very windswept region with little, and there had never really been large forests on the plains. It was mainly just flat open spaces. But it had always been windswept. It's always been a very windy region, and there were no trees really to block the wind. But it had never been a problem before mass settlement, because the farming, because the natives did not farm. The natives did not intensively farm the land. And if you remember back to our lectures on the Great Plains, on settling the Great Plains, one of the major problems that the early settlers encountered was that traditional farming methods could not be implemented, could not be used on the plains. They could not go in and sort of break up that tough prairie sod with regular hoes and shovels and axes and whatnot. They needed those heavy mechanized machinery, those John Deere tractor plows to sort of cut into that thick stone-like prairie sod. And even afterwards and so forth, because there wasn't a lot of trees, so they didn't have wood to build homes. A lot of the early settlers used that tough prairie sod to construct simple homes with. Breaking up this land, tilling the land, breaking it up, had a very negative effect, because the combination of loosening the soil, in combination with those wind patterns, led to whenever the wind coming up, to all that soil that soil that had now been broken down with now fine dust, just being lifted up effortlessly into the atmosphere, sort of blanketing out, blacking out really the landscape. And when you combine the looseness of the soil with that dry, drought-like conditions, you find that the soil becomes dust, and this is where Dust Bowl comes from. The soil became dust, and as soon as the wind swept in, the wind just picked up the dust fairly easily. It's like it would be like turning on a fan and blowing flour everywhere. The flour just scatters; it sort of blankets the surrounding area once it's been picked up by the wind created by turning on a fan. And that's what sort of happened. There are reports of perfectly sunny days changing in an instant. Cattle and people being suffocated if they were caught out in open fields. Inside, dust would find its way inside of homes, inside of cars. There are reports that everything in these sort of like dust storm paths were just laid asunder. Aside from just creating monster clouds and suffocating everything in the paths, the dust storms created these huge sand dunes that literally littered the farming landscape. It obliterated crop fields, equipment was buried, in some cases homes were buried. The effects were really felt far, far away, because again, this loose soil is being picked up and trafficked in the atmosphere. So we have reports from faraway places, cities on the eastern seaboard, like New York and Philadelphia, where the dust will be carried high away in the Gulf streams and then come down as mud whenever it rained in these cities. It was a peculiar and uniquely American natural phenomena. And the Dust Bowl, as I said, led to the bankrupting of farmers, because their fields were obliterated by the dust, by the dust that led these dust storms that led these huge sand dunes. And it dramatically devalued their land, because who would want to purchase the land? Who's gonna come and recoup that land if this phenomena is gonna be a reoccurring factor? The Grapes of Wrath, written by George Steinbeck, it's really a good look into the effect that the Dust Bowl had in adding to the Depression rose. Steinbeck wrote that the Okies, who were forced off their land by the increased mechanization and the Dust Bowl, he wrote about those Okies, and it really sort of drives home this feeling of helplessness, that it was something that they did, that there was some fatal flaw in them, and that they were really being punished. Now, as stated earlier, Herbert Hoover organized the famine relief efforts after the war, after World War I. He was the only member of the Versailles peace talks to walk away with an enhanced reputation, rather than having his reputation tarnished by the illegitimacy and the negative reaction, the negative treatment then and still now of the Treaty of Versailles. He would later go on to serve as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, and he contributed to the very successful trade policies of the United States during the 1920s. He was the architect of the policies that led to the globalization of American domestic industries. During his tenure, his department was the only federal department to grow while others continually shrank. In the last lecture, we talked about how the federal government shrank. Namely, generally every other federal department shrank, with the exception of the Commerce Department, because of the stellar reputation of Herbert Hoover and the outstanding qualities that he brought to that office, and their great success in expanding American industries. Hoover was a progressive in many respects. He believed in the application. Of efficiency in all these matters. He was also a very firm supporter of rational planning and the use of focus groups and careful oversight. And in this way, he cultivated an expertise in his management style. And upon taking office in 1929, he sought to continue the personal philosophy of American traditional beliefs of self-help, economic independence, but he also hinted at and later revealed a willingness to intervene economically. Now, Hoover was autocratic. He lacked the personal touch and charisma of Warren Harding or his successor Franklin Roosevelt. He lacked the ability to win the easy confidence of those around him. Hoover had been blessed by professional good fortune, but he had never had to face negative conditions before. One of his more pronounced blunders was an attack on the bonus marches, and the bonus marches were marches staged by World War I veterans who marched on Washington to ask the government to pay their veteran bonuses ahead of schedule. Hoover, instead of meeting with their leaders and finding an accord, he ordered the then serving military units located in Washington under the command of Douglas MacArthur and a young then major named Dwight Eisenhower to disperse them. And as more people were displaced and hobo communities established themselves